Hi, today we're going to talk about the common mistakes that IB psychology students make in exams and essays. A very common mistake is to use imprecise vocabulary. So, for example, the word experiment is really overused and often to mean just a study, not an actual experiment. So, unless a study has an independent variable that's manipulated by the researcher and a measurable dependent variable, it's not an experiment. So, if it's not an experiment, use the correct research method, and if you don't know, just use the word study, at least it's not wrong. Another word that is overused is the word prove. To be honest, I would never use it at all in psychology. So instead, you can use lighter, less definite expressions such as provide evidence for, or demonstrate, or show. Finally, there's another one that is annoying, and it's the word cure. Again, in psychology, it's not a word you should use. So treat, provide treatment, or provide relief for the symptoms of a disorder is much more appropriate than the word cure. These might seem like not such a big deal, but if you use many of them, it can really give the impression that you don't know what you're talking about. So using correct, precise vocabulary can make a massive difference to the overall impression you make on the examiner. Another common mistake that's really devastating for grades is not answering the question. So for example, many students don't read the question properly. You really need to pay attention to things like the command terms and what they mean. Also, you really need to limit yourself to what the question is asking. So, for example, if it's asking for one study, you don't need to talk about two, and in fact, the examiners won't even mark the second study. So it's a waste of time, and you would be much better off going into more detail into the first study. Another mistake that has terrible consequences is when you mix similar questions. So there are many questions that sound similar, but you're supposed to talk about something completely different. A typical example is hormones and neurotransmitters. They're different, and so don't mix them up. Another one is social identity theory, which is not the same thing as social learning theory. And if you answer one question with the material you should use for the other, however good your answer may be, if it's irrelevant, you're really going to pay a high price in terms of marks. So be very careful. The best way to deal with this is to practice again and again, picking the correct studies and the correct material for each question until you've really differentiated them. This mistake may seem like an obvious one not to make, but you'd be surprised how many students do make it anyway. And it's particularly true for 8-mark questions, because often you'll only use one or two studies, so they really need to be targeted and to be the very best ones you can use. So you may know 3 or 4 studies about a specific topic, but you really need to ask yourself what the best one is to use here. And it could be that one is more recent, or one that directly answers that particular question, and then that's the one you should pick. So when you're doing revision, you really should know which study you're going to pick for each question. Now let's talk about evaluation, because that's a really big part of your 22-mark questions. For evaluation, very often students tend to evaluate studies, and they think that will fulfill the critical thinking part, but they don't really evaluate the general theories that the studies are based on, and that can be a real problem. So if you're talking about social learning theory, let's say, and you evaluate Bandura's Bobo doll study, and it's lovely, but if you don't talk at all about the theory itself, then you're doing only half the job. And it all comes down to the same problem again, which is answering the question. So when you're evaluating, you need to focus on that question. Only go through the points that are relevant to that question. Otherwise, you're just evaluating for no reason and giving a list of criticisms that might be completely irrelevant. When you are evaluating studies and theories, another thing is to explain why something is a problem. A typical one is students saying, oh, this study is not very good because it's not ecologically valid, and they never explain why it's not ecologically valid and why that's a problem. So you need to explain why that might affect the results and therefore the theory and therefore the evidence you're looking into to answer that particular question. Otherwise, it's irrelevant. Same thing with sampling problems. That seems to be a big favorite among students as well, saying, oh, they only used men or they only used people from one culture, and then they don't go into it. And it may be totally relevant and a great point, but if you don't explain it, then you might as well not say it, because it's just frustrating for the examiner to read that. Another thing is to make a random list of criticisms that is not particularly relevant to the question. Sometimes the evaluation of studies reads like a bullet point list. You really need to pick the most relevant ones for the question, and you really need to develop them. So you're better off with 2 really good, really thoughtful, really relevant criticisms than you are with like a whole list of mindless, empty bullet points. Finally, something that can really make a big difference to your essays is to learn to explain why you're using a particular study for a particular question. So once you're done explaining the study in detail, whether it's in 8-mark or 22-mark questions, you really want to say that you use this study to show something specific. And you should have 1 or 2 sentences at the end of a study that explain why you use the study and why it's relevant to the question. It really helps you stay focused on the question itself. So that's it. I hope this helps, and good luck in your exams and tests.